Infanteria, to je láska má. Infanteria.
Okay. I think we're about where I thought we should be to start the next session. So let me give my overview introductions to our next group of readers. Okay, so we'll have, starting chapter 3, will be Julia Sutton-Mattocks, who is a lecturer in Czech and Russian literature and culture at the University of Bristol in Bristol, UK. She'll be followed by Karen Adams, who is a South African English lecturer in Oman. And after that, moving on to chapter 4, we will have Ambassador Martin Dvořák, currently Czech ambassador to Kuwait and Qatar, formerly our good friend here in New York as Czech Consul General in New York City. After that, into chapter 5, we'll have Jane Arnfield, an associate professor of theatre and performance at Northumbria University in Newcastle on Tyne, UK. And we have an emergency replacement reader. Following that will be Harriet Landseer coming off the bench to fill in for someone who was indisposed. She's an art historian, now currently in Dublin, Ireland. And then for chapter 6, we'll have the mother-daughter team of Julia and Miriam Sherwood. Julia is a terrific translator from Czech and Slovak, and she's in London, and her daughter Miriam, a theater maker and fundraiser, also in London. And to round out this group, we'll have Maxwell Zehner, an actor and audiobook narrator here in New York. And we have Julia all ready to go.
Chapter 3, Švejk before the medical experts. The clean, cosy cubicles of the regional criminal court made the most favourable impression on Švejk. The whitewashed walls, the black painted bars, and the fat Mr. De Martini, the chief warder for the prisoners on remand, with his purple facings and purple braid on his government-supplied cap. Purple is the colour prescribed not only here, but also at religious services on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. The glorious times of Roman rule over Jerusalem were coming back. The prisoners were led out and brought before the Pontius Pilates of 1914 down on the ground floor. And the examining magistrates, the Pilates of modern times, instead of honourably washing their hands, sent to Tysings for goulash and pills and beer, and passed more and more indictments to the Director of Prosecutions. Here, all logic mostly disappeared and the paragraph triumphed. The paragraph strangled, went mad, fumed, laughed, threatened, murdered, and gave no quarter. The magistrates were jugglers with the law, high priests of its letter, devourers of the accused, tigers of the Austrian jungle, who measured their spring on the accused by the number of clauses. The exception were a few gentlemen, as at police headquarters, who did not take the law quite so seriously, for everywhere wheat can be found among the tares. It was to one of these gentlemen that they conducted Švejk for questioning. He was an elderly gentleman of affable appearance who, when he was once interrogating the notorious murderer Valeš, never failed to tell him, "Be so good as to sit down, Mr. Valeš, there is an empty chair just here." When they led Švejk before him, with his natural amiability, he asked him to sit down and said, "So you are this Mr. Švejk, then?" "I think I must be," answered Švejk, "because my papa was Mr. Švejk and my mama was Mrs. Švejk, and I can't disgrace them by denying my own name." A kindly smile flitted across the face of the examining magistrate. "Well, you've been up to a fine lot of things. You've certainly got a great deal on your conscience." "I've always got a great deal on my conscience," said Švejk, smiling even more affably than the magistrate. "I've probably got more on my conscience than your worship is pleased to have." "Well, that's clear from the statement you signed," said the magistrate, in no less affable tone. "They didn't bring any pressure on you at the police station, did they?" "Why, of course not, your worship. I asked them myself if I had to sign it, and when they told me to do so, I obeyed. After all, I wouldn't want to quarrel with them just because of my signature, would I? It certainly wouldn't be in my interest to do that. There must be law and order. Do you feel completely well, Mr. Švejk? Not completely well, no, I wouldn't say that, Your Worship. I've got rheumatism and I rub myself with Elliman's imbrication. The old gentleman again gave a kindly smile. What would you say if we were to have you examined by our medical experts? I don't think that I can be so bad that these gentlemen need unnecessarily waste their time on me. I was examined by one doctor already at police headquarters to see if I'd got VD. You know, all the same, Mr. Švejk, we'll try with these medical experts. We'll set up a nice commission and keep you in remand under investigation. In the meantime, you will have a nice rest. Now, just one more question. Is it true, as it is stated in the report, that you declared and widely disseminated the view that war would soon break out? Oh yes, Your Worship, and it will break out very soon indeed. And you don't occasionally feel run down by any chance? Oh no, sir, I was only once nearly run down by a car on Charles Square, but that was many years ago. That concluded the interrogation. Švejk shook hands with the magistrate, and after having returned to his cell, said to his neighbours, "Now, all because of that murder of His Imperial Highness, the Archduke Ferdinand, they're going to have me examined by the medical experts." "I've been examined by those medical experts too," said a young man. "That was when I had to come before a jury about some carpets. They certified me as feeble-minded. Now I've embezzled a steam threshing machine and they can't do anything to me. My lawyer told me yesterday that once I've been certified feeble-minded, I'll have the benefit of it for the rest of my life." "I don't trust those medical experts at all," observed the man with the intelligent appearance. "Once, when I forged some bills of exchange, I prepared myself for all eventualities and went to lectures by the psychiatrist Dr. Heveroch, and when they caught me, I pretended to be a paralytic exactly as Dr. Heveroch had described one. I bit one of the medical experts on the commission in the leg, drank ink out of the ink pot, and relieved myself, if you'll pardon the expression, gentlemen, in the corner in the view of the whole commission. But because I bit one of them through the calf, they certified me as completely fit, and so I was done for." "I'm not a bit afraid of these gentlemen's examinations," said Švejk. "When I was in the army, a vet examined me and it didn't turn out at all badly." "Medical experts are swine," the short man with a stoop broke in. "Not long ago, quite by chance, they dug up a skeleton in my meadow, and the medical expert said that it was murdered 40 years ago by some blunt object on the head. Now, I'm 38 and I've been jailed, although I have my birth certificate, an extract from the parish register, and my identity card." And now it's over to Karen Adams in Ibri, Oman.
"I think that we should be fair about everything," said Švejk. "After all, anybody can and must make a mistake, the more he thinks about a thing. Medical experts are human beings, and human beings have their faults. Once in Nusla, just by the bridge across the Bochik, a gentleman came up to me in the night when I was coming back from Ubanzetu and hit me over the head with a knout. And when I was lying on the ground, he flashed his torch on me and said, 'It's a mistake. It's not him.' And he got so angry because he'd made a mistake that he hit me on the back again. It's only human nature that a chap should go on making mistakes until he dies. It's just like that gentleman who one night found a mad, half-frozen dog, took it home with him and put it in his wife's bed. As soon as it had got warmed up, it bit the whole family and tore to pieces and devoured the baby in the cradle. Or I can give you an example of a mistake a turner who lives in our house once made. He opened the chapel at Podoli with his key because he thought it was his kitchen, and lay down on the altar because he thought that he was home in bed. And then he pulled over himself some cloths with holy inscriptions and put the New Testament and other sacred books under his head to make it higher. In the morning, he was found by the sexton, and when he came to himself, he told him quite good-humouredly there was only a little mistake. A nice little mistake, said the sexton, when all because of it we shall have to have the church reconsecrated. After that, the turner came before the medical experts, and they proved to him that he had been completely sensible and sober, because if he had been tight, they said, he wouldn't have been able to fit the key into the lock of the chapel door. Afterwards, that turner died in pancreas. I can also give you another example of how a police dog at Cladno made a mistake. It was an Alsatian which belonged to the famous cavalry captain Rotter. Captain Rotter bred these dogs and experimented with them on tramps until all the tramps began to avoid the district of Cladno. And so he gave orders that the gendarmes must bring in some suspicious individual without fail. Well, once they brought him a quite respectably dressed man whom they'd found in the forest of Lani sitting on a tree stump, the captain at once had a piece of his coat-tails cut off and given to his police dogs to sniff. And then they took the man away to brickworks behind the town and set their trained dogs onto his tracks. The dogs found him and brought him back again. Then the man had to climb up a ladder to a loft, leap over a wall, and jump into a lake with the dogs after him. In the end, it turned out that he was a deputy of the Czech Radical Party who'd gone for an outing in the woods of Lani after having got bored with Parliament. And that's why I say that people are erring creatures by nature. They make errors, never mind whether they're learned people or stupid, uneducated idiots. Even ministers make mistakes. The Commission of Medical Experts, which had to decide whether Švejk's mental horizon did or did not correspond to all the crimes with which he was charged, consisted of 3 unusually solemn gentlemen, whose views were such that the view of each differed gloriously from any of the views of the other 2. 3 different scientific schools and psychiatric views were represented there. If in the case of Švejk, complete treatment had been reached between these opposing scientific camps, it can be explained purely and simply by the stunning impression he produced upon them when he entered the room where his mental state was to be examined, and observing a picture of the Austrian monarch hanging on the wall, cried out, "Long live our Emperor, Franz Joseph I, gentlemen." The case was clear as daylight. Švejk's spontaneous declaration disposed of a whole range of questions, and there only remained a few very important questions which were needed, so that from Švejk's answers, the initial opinion of him could be confirmed according to the system of the psychiatrist Dr. Callison, Dr. Dvořák, and the Englishman Viking. "Is radium heavier than lead?" "Please, sir, I haven't weighed it," answered Švejk with his sweet smile. "Do you believe in the end of the world?" "I'd have to see that end first," Švejk answered nonchalantly. "But certainly I shan't see it tomorrow. Would you know how to calculate the diameter of the globe?" "No, I'm afraid I wouldn't," answered Švejk, "but I'd like to ask you a riddle myself, gentlemen. Take a 3-storied house with 8 windows on each floor. On the roof, there are 2 dormer windows and 2 chimneys. On every floor, there are 2 tenants. And now tell me, gentlemen, in which year the house porter's grandmother died?" The medical experts exchanged knowing looks, but nevertheless, one of them asked this further question. "You don't know the maximum depth of the Pacific Ocean?" "No, please, sir, I don't," was the answer, "but I think it must be definitely deeper than the Vltava below the rock of Vyšehrad." The chairman of the commission asked briefly, "Is that enough?" But nonetheless, another member requested the following question. "How much is 12,897 times 13,863? 729, answered Švejk without batting an eyelid. "I think that will do," said the chairman of the commission. "You can take the accused back where he came from." "Thank you, gentlemen," replied Švejk deferentially. "For me, it will do too." After his departure, the 3 agreed that Švejk was a patent imbecile, an idiot according to all the natural laws invented by the luminaries of psychiatry. The report, which was passed to the examining magistrate, contained inter alia the following. The undersigned medical experts certify the complete mental feebleness and congenital idiocy of Joseph Švejk, who appeared before the aforesaid commission and expressed himself in terms such as "Long live our Emperor Franz Joseph I," which utterance is sufficient to illuminate the state of mind of Joseph Švejk as that of a patent imbecile. The undersigned commission accordingly recommends that the investigation of Joseph Švejk be quashed, that Joseph Švejk be sent to a psychiatric clinic for observation to establish how far his mental state is a danger to his surroundings. While this report was being compiled, Švejk was telling his fellow prisoners, they didn't care a hoot about Ferdinand, but talked to me about even stupider nonsense. Finally, we agreed that we talked about was quite enough for us, and we parted. I don't believe anyone observed the short man with the stoop on whose meadow a skeleton happened to have been dug up. They're all of them a gang of crooks. There have to be crooks in this world too, said Švejk, lying down on his straw mattress. If everyone were honest with each other, they'd soon start punching each other's noses. I now hand over to Martin Dvořák, the Czech ambassador to Kuwait and Qatar, former Czech consul general in New York.
And I'd like to continue with chapter 4, Švejk thrown out of the lunatic asylum. When Švejk subsequently described life in the lunatic asylum, he did so in exceptionally eulogistic terms. I really don't know why those loonies get so angry when they are kept there. You can crawl naked on the floor, howl like a jackal, rage and bite. If anyone did this anywhere on the promenade, the people would be astonished, but there isn't the most common or garden thing to do. There is a freedom there which not even socialists have ever dreamed of. A chap can pass himself off as a God Almighty, the Virgin Mary, the Pope, the King of England, His Imperial Majesty, or St. Wenceslaus, although the chap who said he was St. Wenceslaus was tied up naked all day long and lay in solitary confinement. There was also a chap who shouted out that he was the archbishop, but all he did was to eat and, if you pardon the expression, do something else which rhymes with it, excrete. But no one's ashamed to doing that there. One chap even pretended to be St. Cyril and St. Methodius just to get a double portion. And there was a gentleman there who was pregnant and invited everyone to the christening. There were many people shut up there who were chess players, politicians, fishermen and scouts, stamp collectors and amateur photographers. One person was there because of some old pots, which he called funerary urns. One was in a straitjacket all the time so that he shouldn't be able to calculate when the word would come to an end. And I also met a certain number of professors there. One of them used to follow me about all the time and expatiate on how the cradle of the gypsy race was in Krkonoše. And the other explained to me that inside the globe there was another globe much bigger than the outer one. Everyone there could say exactly what he pleased and what was on the tip of his tongue, just as he was in a parliament. Sometimes they used to tell each other fairy stories and started fainting when something very bad happened to a princess. The widest of them all was a gentleman who pretended to be the 16th volume of Otto's Encyclopedia and asked everybody to open him and to find the entry cardboard box stapling machine, otherwise he would be done for. He only quieted them down when they put him into a straitjacket. Then he was happy because he thought he had got into a bookbinder's press and begged to be given a modern trim. It was really like living in paradise here. You could kick up a row, fight, sing, cry, bleed, yell, jump, say your prayers, turn somersaults, crawl on all fours, hop, run about, dance, skip, squat all day or your haunches and climb up the walls. No one come to you and tell you, you mustn't do that, sir. It's not decent. You should be ashamed of yourself. Aren't you properly brought up? It's true, however, that there are loonies there who are quite quiet. There was one well-brought-up inventor, for instance, who continually picked his nose and said only once a day, I have just discovered electricity. As I say, it was a very pleasant there, and those few days which I spent in the lunatic asylum are among the loveliest hours of my life. And indeed, the very welcome which awaited Švejk in the asylum when they had taken him away from the criminal court and brought him there for observation surpassed his expectation. First, they stripped him naked, then they gave him a hospital gown and led him off to have a bath, holding him familiarly under his arms, while one of the male nurses entertained him by telling him some jokes about Jews. In the bathroom, they immersed him in a tub of warm water and then pulled him out and put him under a cold douche. They repeated this 3 times and then asked him how he liked it. Švejk said that it was better than in the bath near the Charles Bridge and that he liked bathing very much. If you'll only cut my nails and my hair too, I will have everything I need to make me completely happy, he added with a pleasant smile. And his request of his was granted too, and after they had thoroughly rubbed him down with a sponge as well, they wrapped him in a sheet, carried him off to the first ward, put him onto a bed, covered him with a quilt, and asked him to go to sleep. And even today, Švejk talks about it with affection. Just imagine, they really carried me off. It was in state of utter bliss at the moment. I was. And indeed, he fell blissfully asleep on the bed. Then they woke him to offer him a mug of milk and roll. The roll was already cut up into little pieces, and while one of the warders held him both his arms, the other dipped the pieces of roll into the milk and fed him like a goose is fed on dumplings. When they had finished feeding him, they took him under the arms and led him off to WC, where they asked him to perform his large and small bodily needs. And Švejk talks with affection about this lovely moment too, and I certainly don't need to reproduce his word describing what they did with him after that. I will only mention that he said one of them held me in his arms while I was doing it. When they brought him back, they put him to bed again and asked him once more to go to sleep. But just as he had dozed enough, they woke him up and took him to the examination room, where, standing stark naked before 2 doctors, he was reminded of the glorious time when he was called up. The German word tauglich, or fit for service, fell spontaneously from his lips. What are you saying? Asked one of the doctors. Take 5 paces forward and 5 to the rear. Švejk took 10. But I told you to take 5, said the doctor. A few paces more or less are all the same to me, said Švejk. After that, the doctors asked him to sit down on a chair, and one of them tapped him on the knee. Then he said to the other doctor that the reflexes are very perfectly correct, whereupon the other shook his head and began to tap Švejk's knee himself, while the first doctor opened wide Švejk's eyelids and examined his pupils. After that, they went away to a table and let fall 1 or 2 expressions in Latin. Listen, can you sing? One of them asked Švejk. Would you please sing us a song? With pleasure, gentlemen, Švejk answered. I haven't any voice or musical ear, you know, but I'll have a shot. I'll do it to please you if you want to be amused. And Švejk struck up. The little monk sat in the chair and scalding tears ran down his cheeks. Feverishly, he tore his hair. I'm afraid I don't know anymore, continued Švejk. If you like, I can also sing you Oh, this in my heart, my bosom, his face laden thin, as I sit here and gaze afar, the where I'm bound to love sweet chain, and I can't remember any more of it either. Side, Švejk. I also know the first verse of Where is My Home, and General Windischkreuz as the cock did crow, and a few folk songs too, like God Save Our Emperor and Land, or When We March to Aramjes, and Hail to Thee, Holy Virgin, Hail 1,000 times. The learned doctors exchanged glances, and one of them put the following question to Švejk. Have you ever had your mental condition examined? In the army, Švejk replied solemnly and proudly, I was officially certified by military doctors as a patent idiot. I believe you are malingerer, the other doctor shouted on Švejk. What, me, gentlemen? Said Švejk, defending himself. No, I assure you I am no malingerer. I am a genuine idiot. You only have to ask at České Budějovice or at Reserve Command at Karlín. The elder of two doctors waved his hand in a gesture of despair and pointing to Švejk, said to the nurses, give this man back his clothes and send him to the 3rd class in the first corridor. Then one of you come back and take all his papers to the office and tell them there to settle the case quickly so that we don't have him round our necks for long. The doctors cast another devastating look at Švejk, who begged deferentially to the door, bowing politely. When one of the nurses asked him what nonsense he was up to now, he answered, as I am not dressed, I'm naked, and I wouldn't like to show these gentlemen anything in case they should think me rude or vulgar. From the moment the nurses received orders to return Švejk's clothes to him, they no longer showed the slightest concern for him. They told him to get dressed, and one of them took him to the 3rd class, where during the few days it took the office to complete his discharge formalities, he had an opportunity of carrying on his agreeable observation. The disappointed doctors gave him a certificate that he was a malingerer whose mind was affected. But as they discharged him before he was given any lunch, it led to a minor scene. Švejk declared that if they threw anyone out of lunatic asylum, they had no right to do it so without giving him lunch. This breach of the public peace was stopped by a police officer who had been summoned by the asylum porter and who took Švejk off to the police station in Salmova Street. And now it's my honor to turn the floor over to Jane Arnfield to Newcastle upon Tyne.
Thank you very much, Martin. Chapter 5, Švejk at the police station in Salmova Street. After Švejk's beautiful sunny days in the asylum came hours full of persecution. Police Inspector Braun set the scene for his meeting with Švejk with all the cruelty of Roman lictors in the time of the charming Emperor Nero. With the same ruthlessness as they said, throw this scoundrel of a Christian to the lions, Inspector Braun said, put him behind bars. Not a word more or less, except that Inspector Braun's eyes shone with a peculiarly perverted lust. Švejk bowed and said proudly, I'm ready, gentlemen. I believe behind bars means the same as a prison cell, and that's not too bad. Don't make yourself too much at home here, answered the police officer, whereupon Švejk piped up, I'm quite modest and grateful for anything you can do for me. In the cell, a man was sitting on a plank bed, deep in thought. He sat listlessly, and it was clear from his expression that when the key grated in the lock of the cell, he did not believe that the door would open to set him free. My compliments, Your Honour, said Švejk, sitting down beside him on the plank bed. What time might it be? Time is not my master, the thoughtful man answered. Well, it's not too bad here, Švejk continued. They've at least planed the wood on this plank bed. The solemn man made no reply. He stood up and began to rush about in the tiny space between the door and the bed, as if he were hurrying to save something. In the meantime, Švejk observed with interest the writing scrawled upon the walls. There was one inscription in which an unknown prisoner solemnly pledged to heaven a fight to the death with the police. It read, "You won't half catch it." Another prisoner had written, "Buzz off, you cops." Another merely recorded the plain fact, "I was locked up here on 5th of June, 1913, and wasn't too badly treated. Josef Maracek, tradesman from Vršovice." And there was another inscription, with which actually it was earth-shattering in its profundity. "Have mercy, Almighty God." And underneath, "Kiss my A." The letter A had been crossed out, however, and instead was written in capitals, "Coat tails." Beside it, some poetical soul had written the lines, "I sit in sorrow by the stream, the sun is hid behind the fells. I watch the radiant mountain tops where my best beloved dwells." The man, who was rushing between the door and the plank bed as though he were trying to win a marathon race, stopped and breathlessly resumed his seat. He plunged his head in his hands and suddenly screamed, "Let me out!" "No, they won't let me out," he said to himself. "They won't, they won't. I've been here since 6 o'clock this morning." He then had a fit of expansiveness, stood up erect, asked Švejk, "You don't by any chance have a strap on you so that I can end it all?" "That's something I can very gladly help you with," answered Švejk, undoing his belt. "I've never yet seen anyone hang himself on a strap in a prison cell." "Only it's a nuisance that there's no hook here," he went on, looking around him. "The window latch won't bear your weight unless you hang yourself by kneeling by the plank bed, like the monk did in the Emmaus monastery, where he hanged himself on a crucifix because of a young Jewess. I'm very fond of suicide, so just carry on. Well begun is half done." The gloomy man, into whose hands Švejk had pushed the strap, gave it one look, threw it into the corner and burst out crying, smearing his tears with his black hands and shrieking out, "I've got little children. I'm here for drunkenness and immoral practices. My God, my poor wife, what will they say to me in the office? I'm here for drunkenness and immoral practices," etc., etc., ad infinitum. At last, however, he calmed down a little, went to the door and began to kick it and pound it with his fists. From behind the door could be heard steps and a voice. "What do you want?" "Let me out," he said in a voice which sounded as if it had nothing left to live for. "Where to?" came the answer from the other side. "To my office," answered the unfortunate father, official, drunkard, and libertine. Laughter could be heard in the quiet of the passageway. Horrible laughter, and the steps went away again. "It seems to me that the gentleman must hate you if he laughs at you like that," said Švejk, when the despairing man sat down beside him again. "A policeman like that might do a lot of harm when he gets angry, and when he gets angrier, he still might do anything. Just sit down quietly, if you don't want to hang yourself, and wait and see how things develop. If you're an official, you're married and you have little babes, it's frightful, I must admit. If I'm not mistaken, you're probably convinced that they'll sack you from the office." "I can't say," he sighed, "because I don't remember myself what I was up to. I only know that I got thrown out from somewhere and that I wanted to get back there to light a cigar. But it started splendidly. Our departmental chief was celebrating his name day and invited us to a wine restaurant. Then we went to a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, an eighth, a ninth. Wouldn't you like me to help you count?" asked Švejk. "I'm a bit of an expert. One night I was in 28 pubs, but God's truth, I never had at the most more than 3 glasses of beer in any one of them." In short, continued the unfortunate subordinate of the departmental chief who had celebrated his name day in such magnificent style, when we'd been in about a dozen different dens, we discovered we'd lost our chief, although we tied him with a string and led him with us like a little dog. And so we went to look for him everywhere, and finally we all lost each other until in the end I found myself in one of those night cafes in Vinohrady, a very decent place where I drank a liqueur straight out of the bottle. What I did afterwards, I can't remember. I only know that when they brought me to the police station here, 2 policemen reported that I was drunk, had been behaving immorally, had hit a lady, taken down somebody else's hat from the peg and cut it into shreds with my penknife, chased away the ladies' orchestra, accused the head waiter in front of everyone of stealing 20 crowns, smashed the marble slab at the table where I was sitting, and intentionally spat into the black coffee of a stranger at the next table. I didn't do anything else. At least I can't remember having done so. And believe me, I'm a decent, intelligent man who hasn't a thought for anything except his family. What do you say to that? I'm certainly not a hooligan. Švejk made no reply, but asked with interest, did you have much trouble smashing that marble slab, or did you do it in one go? At one go, answered the intelligent gentleman. Then you're for it, said Švejk pensively. They'll prove to you that you coaxed yourself, for it was intensive training, and that the stranger's coffee, which you spat into, was it with rum or not? And without waiting for an answer, he explained, if it was with rum, then it'll be worse for you because it's more expensive. In the court, they reckon up every item and add them together so that it amounts at least to a crime. In the court, the conscientious paterfamilias whispered dejectedly, and, hanging his head, lapsed into that unpleasant state in which a man is devoured by the reproaches of his conscience. Author's note. Some writers use the expression gnawed by the reproaches of his conscience. I do not regard this expression as altogether appropriate. After all, a tiger devours a man and does not gnaw him. The next reader will be Elizabeth Andrews in New York.
We had a substitution, and so in fact our new speaker is Harriet Lenz here in Dublin.
And do they know at home that you're in jail? Švejk asked. Or will they wait till it's in the paper? Do you think it will be in the paper? Was the naive question of the victim of the name day party of his departmental chief. Why, it's a dead certainty, was the frank answer, for Švejk was never one to conceal anything from others. All the newspaper readers will get a kick out of what you did. I also like to read that column about drunks and their escapades. Not long ago, at the pub, the Chalice, one of the guests didn't do anything more than break his own head with a glass. He threw the glass up into the air and then stood underneath it. But they carried him off, and the very next morning we read it in the papers. Or in Benlovka, I once slapped an undertaker's mute, and he slapped me back. To restore peace between us, they had to arrest us both, and at once it was in the afternoon paper. Or when that councillor smashed 2 cups in the Café the Corpse, do you imagine they spared him? It was immediately in the newspapers the day after. All you can do is to send a correction to the papers from jail, saying that the information published about you has nothing to do with you, and that you're no relative of the person of that name, and have no connection with him. And you must write home and tell them to cut your correction out of the paper and keep it, so that you can read it when you've served out your sentence. Aren't you cold? Asked Švejk, who was full of compassion when he saw that the intelligent gentleman was shivering. This year the summer has turned very cold. I'm done for, sobbed Švejk's companion. I've lost my promotion now. You certainly have, Švejk agreed readily. And if they don't take you back, into the office after you've served out your sentence, I don't know whether you'll find another job so quickly, because anyone at all you wanted to work for, even if it was a Skinner, would require from you a certificate of good conduct. No, a moment of debauchery like what you've indulged in costs you dear. And will your wife and children have anything to live on while you're sitting in jail? Or will she have to go and beg and teach the babe to all sorts of vices? A sob could be heard. My poor little babes and my poor wife. The conscienceless penitent stood up and started talking about his babes. He had 5. The eldest was 12 and was one of those scouts. He only drank water and ought to have been an example to his father, who had misbehaved like this for the first time in his life. A scout, exclaimed Švejk. I like hearing about those scouts. Once in Midlovary near Zliv, district Hluboka, police district České Budějovice, just when we of the 91st were doing our training, the peasants from the neighborhood started a hunt for scouts who were swarming in the parish wood. They caught 3 of them. When they tied up the smallest of them, he moaned, squealed, and wailed so much that we hardened soldiers could not bear the sight of it and thought it better to clear off. While these 3 scouts were being tied up, they bit 8 peasants. Afterwards, under the torture of the birch, they confessed before the mayor that there wasn't a single meadow in the region that they hadn't flattened out while they lay sunbathing. And then again, they said that it was only by pure accident that the field of standing corn near Ražice burnt down. It was just before the harvest, and they only happened to be roasting a deer on a spit in the middle of it, one they'd stalked and killed with their knives in the parish wood. In their howdah in the wood were found more than 1/2 hundredweight of gnawed bones of poultry and game, an enormous quantity of cherry stones, heaps of cores of unripe apples, and other good things. The scout's poor father was not to be comforted, however. What have I done? He wailed. My reputation is ruined. It certainly is, said Švejk with his characteristic frankness. After all you've done, your reputation will certainly be ruined for life. When your friends have read all about it in the newspapers, they'll certainly add something to it of their own. They always do that, but don't be worried about it. There are 10 times more people in the world with blemished reputations than there are with unblemished ones. That's just a very unimportant trifle. In the passage, energetic steps could be heard. The key grated in the lock, the door opened, and a policeman called Švejk's name. Excuse me, said Švejk, chivalrously. I've only been here since 12 noon, but this gentleman has been here since 6 o'clock this morning. I'm not in a hurry anyway. Instead of getting an answer, Švejk was dragged into the passage by the powerful arm of a policeman and silently led up the stairs to the 1st floor. In the 2nd room, a police inspector was sitting at a table. He was a fat gentleman of amiable countenance and said to Švejk, "So you're this Švejk then, and how did you get here?" "The most common or garden way in the world," answered Švejk. "I came here under the escort of a police officer, because I wasn't going to put up with them throwing me out of the lunatic asylum without any lunch. It was as though they took me for a kicked-out whore." "All right, Švejk," said the inspector affably. "Why should we have to be bothered with you here at Sutton-Mattocks Street? Wouldn't it be better to send you to police headquarters?" "You're master of the situation, as the saying goes," said Švejk with composure. "A walk to the police headquarters now in the evening would be quite a pleasant little stroll." "I'm glad we agree about that," said the inspector cheerfully. "It's much better when we agree, isn't it, Švejk?" "And I'm always awfully glad to take advice from anyone too," replied Švejk. "I'll never forget your kindness to me, Inspector. Believe me, I won't." Bowing deferentially, He went down to the guardroom accompanied by the police officer, and a quarter of an hour later could be seen at the corner of Yetchna Street and Charles Square under the escort of another police officer who was carrying under his arm a voluminous book of prisoners' records with the German title Arrestandatenbuch. At the corner of Spalena Street, Švejk and his escort met a crowd of people who were surging around a placard that had been hung up. That's His Imperial Majesty's proclamation on the declaration of war, said the police officer to Švejk. I prophesied it, said Švejk, but in the lunatic asylum they still don't know about it, although they should have got it from the horse's mouth. What do you mean? The police officer asked Švejk. Because they've got a lot of officer gentlemen locked up there, Švejk explained. And when they reached another crowd of people surging in front of the proclamation, Švejk shouted out, God save our Emperor Franz Josef! We shall win this war. Someone in the enthusiastic crowd banged his hat over his ears. And so the good soldier Švejk, surrounded by a crowd of people, stepped once more through the gates of police headquarters. Quite definitely, we'll win this war. I repeat it once more, gentlemen. And with these words, Švejk took leave of the crowd which accompanied him. And somewhere from the dim ages of history, the truth dawned upon Europe that the morrow would obliterate the plans of today. And I'm now turning over to Julia and Miriam Sherwood in London.
We'll be reading chapter 6, Švejk home again after having broken through the vicious circle. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can someone nod? Chris?
Yes.
The spirit of alien authority pervaded the building of the police headquarters, an authority which was ascertaining how enthusiastic the population were for the war. With the exception of a few people who were ready to admit that they were sons of a nation which had to bleed for interests completely alien to it, police headquarters presented the finest collection of bureaucratical beasts of prey, to whom jails and gallows were the only means of defending the existence of the twisted clauses of the law.
They treated their victims with malicious affability, weighing every word carefully in advance. I am very sorry that you've fallen into our hands again, said one of these black and yellow striped vultures when they brought Švejk before him. We thought that you'd reform, but we've been disappointed.
Švejk mutely nodded his head and assumed so innocent an expression that the black and yellow vulture looked at him inquiringly and said emphatically,
Take that imbecile expression off your face. But he immediately went over to an amiable tone and continued, Of course, it's very disagreeable for us to keep you in custody, and I can assure you that, in my opinion, your guilt can't be so enormous. With your absence of intelligence, you must obviously have been led astray. Tell me, Mr. Švejk, who was it really who led you to commit such stupidities?
Švejk coughed and replied, Begging your pardon, sir, I know nothing of any stupidities.
But wasn't it stupidity, Mr. Švejk, he said in an artificially paternal tone, when, according to the deposition of the police officer who brought you here, you caused a crowd of people to collect in front of the war proclamation, which was posted up at the corner, and you incited people with shouts of God save our Emperor Franz Josef, this war is already won.
I couldn't hand back, declared Švejk, fixing his honest eyes on the eyes of the Inquisitor. I was so angry when I saw how they were all reading this proclamation, and none of them were expressing any joy. There were no shouts of God save our Emperor, no hoorays, nothing at all, Inspector. It was just as if they didn't care. An old soldier of the 91st Regiment like me couldn't go on looking at it, and so I shouted out those words. And I believe that had you been in my place, you'd have done exactly the same as I did. If there's a war, it must be won, and people must call out, God save our Emperor. No one will talk me out of that.
Crushed and overcome, the black and yellow wolf could not withstand the gaze of the pure and innocent lamb Švejk. He lowered his gaze onto the official documents and said, "I give you full marks for your enthusiasm, but if only it had been displayed in different circumstances. After all, you know very well that you were under police escort and that a patriotic pronouncement like that could and must have been regarded by the public as ironic rather than serious."
When a chap is being led under police escort, answered Švejk, it's a very hard moment in his life. And if a man, even in such a difficult moment as that, doesn't forget what he ought to do when there's a war on, I think he's not so bad after all.
The black and yellow wolf growled and looked Švejk in the eyes once more. Švejk parried with the innocent, gentle, modest and tender warmth of his gaze. For a moment, they both went on staring fixedly at each other. "Go to hell, Švejk," said the official at last. "And if you ever come here again, I shan't ask you any questions, but march you straight off to the military court at Hradčany. Do you understand?"
But before he could say Jack Robinson, Švejk had stepped towards him, kissed his hand and said, "May the good Lord reward you for everything. If at any time you should need a thoroughbred little dog, just ask me. I deal in dogs."
And so Švejk found himself at liberty again and on his way home. He could not make up his mind whether he should stop first at the Chalice. Finally, he decided he would, and opened the door through which he had gone out some time ago under the escort of Detective Brettschneider. A deathly silence reigned in the bar. A few guests sat there, including the sexton from St. Apollinaire. They looked very gloomy. Behind the serving counter sat Mrs. Palivets and stared dully at the beer taps.
"Well, here I am, back again," said Švejk gaily. "May I have a glass of beer, please? What's happened to Mr. Palivets? Is he home again too?"
Instead of replying, Mrs. Palivets burst into tears and, concentrating all her misery onto a special stress on every word, groaned out, "A week ago, he got 10 years.
"There you are then," said Švejk. "So he's already served 7 days of it."
He was always so careful," sobbed Mrs. Palivets. "He always said that about himself."
The customers in the bar maintained a stubborn silence, as though the spirit of Palivets was haunting the room and urging them to even greater caution. "Caution is the mother of wisdom," said Švejk, sitting down at a table to a glass of beer. In the foam, there were little holes made by Mrs. Palivets' tears as they fell into it when she brought the glass to the table for Švejk. "We're living in such times that we are forced to be cautious."
"Yesterday, we had 2 funerals, said the sexton from St. Apollinaire, changing the subject.
"That means somebody must have died," said another customer, whereupon a third added,
"Were they funerals with a catafalque?"
"I'd like to know," said Švejk, "what military funerals are going to be like now there's a war on."
The customers rose, paid, and went out noiselessly. Švejk was left alone with Mrs. Palivets.
"I never imagined that they'd sentence an innocent man to 10 years, he said. "Sentencing an innocent man to 5 years, that's something I've heard of, but 10, that's a bit too much."
"Well, you see, he confessed everything, my old man," sobbed Mrs. Palivets. "What he was saying here about those flies and that picture, he repeated at police headquarters and before the court. I was a witness at the trial, but what evidence could I give when they told me that as I was in a state of relations with my husband, I could forego giving evidence? I was so scared of that state of relations in case it might lead to something else that I got out of giving evidence. And he, poor dear, gave me such a look. I shall never forget that look to my dying day. And after the sentence was passed and they were leading him off, he shouted to them in the passage as though he'd gone off his head, 'Long live free thinking!'"
"And Mr. Brettschneider doesn't come here anymore?" asked Švejk.
"He's been here several times," answered Mrs. Palivets. "He drank a beer or two. asked me who comes here, and listened to the customers talking about football. As soon as they catch sight of him, they start talking about nothing else but football. And he had the jerks, as though at any moment he'd go mad and have a fit. And all that time, he only succeeded in catching an upholsterer from Příčná Street.
It's all a matter of training, observed Švejk. Was that upholsterer a stupid fellow?
Rather like my husband, she replied, weeping. Mr. Brettschneider asked him if he would fire against the Serbs, and he said he couldn't shoot. That he was once at the shooting range and shot through a whole crown. Then we all heard how Mr. Brettschneider took out his notebook and said, "Aha, and here's another nice case of treason." And he went away with that upholsterer from Příčná Street who never came back.
Lots of them never come back, said Švejk. Can I have a rum, please?
Švejk was just having a second glass of rum when Brettschneider came into the bar. Throwing a quick glance at the bar and the empty rooms, he sat down next to Švejk and, ordering a beer, waited to see what he would say.
Švejk took down a newspaper from the hanger and, looking at the last page of advertisements, said, "Well, I never, look at that. A Mr. Čimpera of Straškov, number 5, near Račiněves, is selling a farm with 9 acres of land convenient for school and railway station."
Brettschneider drummed his fingers nervously and, turning to Švejk, said, "I'm surprised that you're interested in farming, Mr. Švejk."
"Oh, it's you, is it?" said Švejk, shaking his hand. "I couldn't recognize you at first. I have a very bad memory. The last time we parted, if I remember right, was in the reception office at police headquarters. What have you been doing since then? Do you come here often?"
"I've come here today because of you," said Brettschneider. "I was told at police headquarters that you sell dogs. I need a nice miniature pinscher or a pom or something of that kind."
"I can get any for you," replied Švejk. "Do you want a thoroughbred animal or a common cur?"
"I think I'll plump for a thoroughbred," replied Brettschneider.
"And why don't you have a police dog?" asked Švejk. "Wouldn't you like one that picks up the scent at once and leads you to the scene of crime? There's a butcher in Vršovice who has one, and he uses it for drawing his cart. You might very well say that that dog has missed its vocation."
"I should like a pom," said Brettschneider with quiet obstinacy. "A pom that doesn't bite."
"Do you want a pom without teeth then?" asked Švejk. "I know of one. It belongs to a pub keeper in Davice."
"Then I'd rather have a miniature pinscher," replied Brettschneider, whose sinological capacities were very elementary and who would never have learned anything about dogs at all had he not got those orders from police headquarters. But the instructions were precise, clear and firm. To get on familiar terms with Švejk on the basis of his dog dealing, for which purpose he had the right to choose assistants and dispose of funds for the purchase of dogs.
"There are bigger and smaller miniature pinschers," said Švejk. "I know of 2 small ones and 3 big ones. You can nurse all 5 of them on your lap. I can recommend them to you very warmly."
"That's what I'd like," said Brettschneider. "And how much would it be if I only took one?"
"It goes by sizes," answered Švejk. "It depends on the size, you see. A miniature pinscher is not a calf. With miniature pinschers, it's just the opposite. The smaller they are, the dearer they come."
"I'm considering getting larger ones, which would be good watchdogs," answered Brettschneider, who was beginning to fear that he might overburden the secret funds of the state police.
"All right then," said Švejk. "I can sell you the bigger ones for 50 crowns and bigger ones still for 45 crowns. But we've forgotten one thing. Are they to be puppies or grown dogs? Dogs or bitches?"
"It's all the same to me," answered Brettschneider, who was here on unfamiliar ground. "Get them for me and I'll come and fetch them tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the evening. Is that all right?"
"Come along and it'll be all right," answered Švejk dryly. "But in this case, I must ask you for a deposit of 30 crowns.
"By all means," said Brettschneider, paying out the money. "And now let's have a quarter a litre of wine, on me. When they had drunk it up, Švejk stood Brettschneider another quarter, and then Brettschneider invited Švejk not to be afraid of him, saying that today he was not on duty and that it was all right to speak to him about politics.
Švejk declared that he never spoke about politics in the pub, that politics in general were only for babies.
Brettschneider's views were, on the contrary, more revolutionary. He said that every weak state was doomed to extinction and asked Švejk what his views were on this subject.
Švejk said that he had nothing to do with the state, but that he had once had to look after a St. Bernard puppy in a weak state. He had fed it on army biscuits, but it had pegged out all the same.
When each of them had had a fifth quarter litre, Brettschneider declared that he was an anarchist and asked Švejk what organisation he would recommend him to join.
Švejk said that an anarchist once purchased from him a Leonberger dog for 100 crowns and never paid him the last installment.
During the sixth quarter litre, Brettschneider talked about revolution and against mobilisation, whereupon Švejk leaned towards him and whispered in his ear.
"The customer's just come in. Be careful, he doesn't hear you. Otherwise you might be in trouble. You see the landlord's wife's already in tears."
Mrs. Palivets was indeed crying on her chair behind the service counter. "What are you crying for, Mrs. Palivets?" asked Brettschneider. "In 3 months' time, we'll have won the war, there'll be an amnesty, your husband will return, and then we'll have a fine celebration." "Or don't you think that we shall win?" he asked, turning to Švejk.
"Why keep on always playing that gramophone record?" said Švejk. "We've got to win, and that's that. And now I must go home."
And the next reader will be Maxwell Zena in New York City.
Švejk paid his bill and returned to his old charwoman, Mrs. Miller, who was scared when she realized that the man who was opening the door of the flat with his latchkey was Švejk. "Oh, Lord, sir, I thought you wouldn't be returning here for many years," she said with her usual frankness. "And so, in the meanwhile, out of charity, I took a porter from a nightclub as a lodger, because we've had a police search here 3 times, and when they couldn't find anything, they said it was all up with you, because you were so cunning." Švejk was at once able to convince himself that the unknown lodger had made himself very much at home. He was sleeping in his bed, and was indeed so noble as to be content with only half of it, having placed in the other half a long-haired creature who gratefully slept embracing him round the neck, while articles of male and female attire were scattered higgledy-piggledy round the bed. From this chaos it was evident that the nightclub porter had returned with his lady in a jocund mood. "Sir," said Švejk, shaking the intruder, "make sure that you're not late for lunch. I should hate it if you had to say that I had thrown you out after you'd lost your chance of getting any lunch." The porter from the nightclub was very sleepy, and it took a long time before he understood that the owner of the bed had returned home and was making a claim to it. Like all nightclub porters, this gentleman declared that he would smash anyone who woke him up, and tried to go on sleeping. In the meantime, Švejk collected parts of his clothing, brought them to his bed, and, shaking him energetically, said, "If you don't dress, I'll try to fling you out just as you are onto the street. It'll be a great advantage for you if you're properly dressed when you fly out." "I wanted to sleep until 8 o'clock in the evening," said the porter in a startled voice as he put on his pants. "I am paying the mistress 2 crowns for a day for the bed, and I'm allowed to bring here young ladies from the club. Marina, get up." As he was putting on his collar and tying his tie, he recovered sufficiently to be able to assure Švejk that the nightclub Mimosa was really one of the most respectable nightclubs, and that ladies were only admitted there who had a clean police book, and he cordially invited Švejk to come and visit it. On the other hand, his female companion was not at all pleased with Švejk, and used some very choice expressions, of which the choicest of all was, "You son of an archbishop, you." After the departure of the intruders, Švejk went to settle accounts with Mrs. Miller, but found no trace of her, except for a scrap of paper, upon which, with unusual ease in her scrawly handwriting, she had recorded her thoughts about the unfortunate episode of the loan of Švejk's bed to the porter from the nightclub. "Excuse me, sir, if I don't see you any more, because I'm going to jump out of the window." "She's lying," said Švejk, and waited. Half an hour later, the unfortunate Mrs. Miller crept into the kitchen, and it was clear from her distraught expression that she was expecting words of consolation from Švejk. "If you want to jump out of the window," said Švejk, "go into the sitting room. I've opened the window for you. I wouldn't advise you to jump out of the kitchen window, because you'd fall onto the rose bed in the garden, damage the bushes, and have to pay for them. From the window of the sitting room, you'll fall beautifully onto the pavement, and if you're lucky, you'll break your neck. If not, you'll only break all your ribs, arms, and legs, and you'll have to pay for hospital charges." Mrs. Miller burst into tears, went quietly into the sitting room, and shut the window. Then, coming back, she said, "It's terribly draughty there, and it wouldn't be good for your rheumatism, sir." Then she went to make the bed, put it all in order with unusual care, and returning to Švejk in the kitchen, remarked with tears in her eyes, "Those two puppies, sir, which we had in the courtyard, have pegged out. And that St. Bernard, it ran away when the police made their search." "Oh, my God!" shouted Švejk. "He'll get himself into a fine mess. The police will be after him soon." "He bit one police inspector when they pulled him out from underneath the bed during the search," continued Mrs. Miller. "Before that, one of those gentlemen said there was somebody under the bed, and so they called that St. Bernard to come out in the name of the law. And when he wouldn't, they dragged him out, and he was going to gobble them up. But then he bolted out of the door and never returned. They also cross-questioned me about who comes to see us, whether we get any money from abroad, and then they started insinuating that I was a fool, when I told them that we only get money from abroad very rarely, the last being from the headmaster in Brno, that advance of 60 crowns for an Angora cat which you advertised in Narodni Politika, and instead of which you sent him that blind fox terrier puppy in a date box. After that, they talked to me very affably and recommended me that porter from the nightclub, so that I shouldn't be afraid of being alone in the flat, that very man you've just thrown out." "I've always had bad luck with those authorities, Mrs. Miller. Now you'll see how many of them are going to come here to buy dogs," sighed Švejk. I don't know whether those gentlemen who examined the police archives after the overthrow of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy succeeded in deciphering the items of the secret funds of the state police, where it was written B, 40 crowns, F, 50 crowns, L, 80 crowns, etc. But they certainly were deceived if they thought that B, F, L were the initials of any gentleman who for 40, 50, 80, etc. crowns sold the Czech nation to the Black and Yellow Eagle. B stands for St. Bernard, F for Fox Terrier, and L for Leonberger. All these dogs Brett Schneider took from Švejk to police headquarters. They were ghastly mongrels which had no connection whatsoever with any thoroughbred race which Švejk pretended them to be when he sold them to Brett Schneider. The St. Bernard was a mixture of mongrel poodle and a common street cur. The Fox Terrier had the ears of a Dachshund and was the size of a butcher's dog, with bandy legs as though it had suffered from rickets. The head of the Leonberger recalled the hairy muzzle of a stable pincher. It had a stubbed tail, was the height of a Dachshund, and had bare hindquarters, like the famous naked American dogs. Later, Detective Callis came to buy a dog, and returned with a wildly staring monster which was reminiscent of a spotted hyena with the mane of a collie, and in the accounts of the secret fund came a new item, M, 90 crowns. That monster was passing itself off as a mastiff. But not even Callis succeeded in getting any information out of Švejk. He fared the same as Brett Schneider. Švejk diverted the deftest political conversations to the curing of distemper in puppies, and the most cunningly prepared traps always ended in Brett Schneider bringing back from Švejk another unbelievable mongrel monster. And that was the end of the famous detective Brett Schneider. When he had 7 monsters of this kind in his flat, he shut himself up with them in the back room and starved them so long that they finally gobbled him up. He was so honorable that he saved the state the expense of a funeral. In his personal file at police headquarters, there were recorded under the column Advancement in Service the following poignant words: devoured by his own dogs. When Švejk learned later about this tragic event, he said, "It gives me a headache to think how they're going to put all his pieces together when the day of the Last Judgment comes."
Za císaře pana a jeho rodinu. Za císaře pana a jeho rodinu. Museli jsme vybojovat Hercegovinu.